Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Science Museum and to the Stroke and Association's Amazing Brains Research to Recovery event. It's wonderful that so many of you are able to join us here this evening in the auditorium, but also across the country and indeed the world. We are joined live on Facebook and on Twitter by many people who are interested in this area of research. And if you are joining us online, please do post any questions that you have throughout tonight's broadcast, and I will share some of those questions later on. So thank you if you are joining us online. Stroke changes lives in an instant. It's an explosion in the brain, the control centre for who we are and what we are capable of. And it happens to someone in the UK every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes. It happened to my own mother on the 17th of June, 2017. The day before, I had met her for lunch. She had driven through to Glasgow, where I live. She had a meeting with her lawyer. She was going to have a quick lunch with me. She was going to drive back to her second home, which was her office. At the age of 83, she was still working full-time and running a company. By the time I saw her again, some 36 hours later, she had lost all function in her right side from head to toe. This was complicated by a broken ankle that she suffered during her fall. There followed the toughest year of all of her lives as she struggled to come to terms with her limitations before she sadly suffered a second fatal stroke in July of last year. So as a family, we went through a crash course in stroke, and I learned that although recovery is very tough for very many people, with the right specialist support, a ton of courage and determination, and my goodness, we're going to hear a story of courage and determination this evening, the brain can adapt. But we desperately need more research, more investment, more support, more campaigning, and that is what the Stroke Association does. And thanks to your generosity, the Stroke Association is able to invest in groundbreaking research studies every year. They investigate new ways of preventing strokes, developing more effective emergency treatments for stroke survivors in hospitals, and better ways of supporting people in making the best possible recoveries once they have left hospital. Stroke research can help stroke survivors live independently in their own homes, return to work, primarily take control of their own lives again. And again, from my own experience, it was that was just so important to my mum, and I would imagine to everyone who has suffered a stroke. 5 years ago, the Stroke Association launched a new awards programme to help build the next generation of leaders in stroke research and invest in areas of unmet need. And later this evening, we will announce the latest recipients of these prestigious awards. And if you are joining us online, you can find out more about those recipients through the Stroke Association's Twitter channel. So please do that. But first, we turn to this year's talks. We have 3 short and very powerful presentations which will focus on the role that rehabilitation has to play in stroke recovery. Stroke rehabilitation helps people to increase their independence after stroke and to cope with long-term difficulties. We're going to hear from 3 experts who each have their own unique take on what a vital role that research can play in life after stroke. Now, at the end of the talks, there will be the opportunity to ask questions, so please do save those burning questions until after our speakers have all taken to the stage. And I extend that offer also, as I say, to our online community. If you have any questions throughout the broadcast, please do get in touch with us. Our first talk comes from Professor Nick Ward. Nick is a professor of clinical neurology and neurorehabilitation at UCL Institute of Neurology. In his talk, Nick will examine how lessons from studying the neuroscience of brain injury, particularly the idea of brain plasticity, can bring hope to stroke survivors. So could I please welcome to the floor to deliver our first Amazing Brains talk titled Brain Plasticity, the Key to Stroke Recovery, Professor Nick Ward.
Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. So, let's get started. So we're going to start by thinking about how stroke affects an individual patient. What you're looking at here is the brain scan from a single patient. The damage that you see in that brain has caused profound weakness and inability to move, problems with communication, and difficulty even with thinking. It's a devastating illness for both the individual that it happens to and their family. And it happens to a lot of people. We know that there's a stroke in the UK every 5 minutes. Again, in the UK, we'll have a stroke, 1 in every 5 or 6 people will have a stroke sometime in their life, and it's a major cause of death. But really the thing that we're focusing on this evening are the long-term consequences of stroke. And we also know that it's the most common cause of neurological disability. There are over 1 million people living with the consequences of stroke in the UK, many of whom rely on other people for their care, and we know that that number is going to rise. So it's very important that we start to think in our clinical work and in our research about rebuilding lives after stroke. And I have to say at the moment, we're not doing a very good job of it. 45% of all stroke survivors feel abandoned when they leave hospital. If you look on social media, you'll see messages posted every day about how angry and abandoned people feel. So I was told that there was no point treating my arm as it wouldn't recover. There's a general feeling that after 6 months further treatment is pointless. I was told to give up on physio. I felt abandoned. This was psychologically very damaging. So where does this negative attitude, where does this pessimism come from? I think we have to look at the recovery curve. So we know that after stroke, there's some improvement, but the recovery tends to flatten off at about 3 to 6 months. And at that point, patients are often told that there will be no further improvement, and that can be very demoralizing. Why do people say that? Well, in fact, if you look at the data, it tells us that actually people do continue to deteriorate in the long term. So we have to accept the idea that stroke is a chronic, long-term and progressive disease. So very much like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, these patients need long-term care and support. But in fact, in stroke, for some reason, we stop that a few months after patients leave hospital, and it's not entirely clear why that is. So we need to look at these recovery curves, and we need to say, is that the best that we can do? Is this some predetermined pattern of recovery, or do we need to see this as a challenge and need to try and do better? So that's the gloomy part. I'm going to try and be a bit more positive in the rest of the talk, and we're going to start with an inspirational story. So this is the story of Patricia Neal. Patricia Neal was a famous Hollywood actress. She was married to Roald Dahl, and in 1965 she had a stroke at the age of 39. When she came out of hospital, the doctor said to Roald Dahl, she needs an hour a day of therapy, because obviously they had never heard of the 45-minute rule. And Roald Dahl said back to them, how can an hour a day be enough? So he arranged for friends, neighbours, relatives to come to the house, to sit with Patricia, to get her talking, being active, to communicate, and did this for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, he hired this woman, Valerie Eaton-Griffith, to carry on with the program. And she did this for another year or two. So how did Patricia do? Well, in 1968, she was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress. So she did pretty well. So the point of this story is that Patricia Neal had thousands of hours of rehabilitation. Later we're going to hear about another inspirational story. But the point about these two cases, Patricia and Richard, is not that the recovery was unusual, which I've heard some people say, that somehow this is uncharacteristic of what happens after stroke. What was unusual about these two cases was the amount of rehabilitation that they both received. And I think it challenges us to ask the question, how far can we push patients if we gave them big doses of rehabilitation? And I tell you, we don't know the answer to that question. And I think if we don't know the answer to that question, I don't see how we can plan healthcare services for stroke recovery. So where's the hope? Where does the hope from the neuroscience come in? Well, people often talk about brain reorganization and plasticity, and I want you to look at these images. What they're showing you in two different patients, top and bottom, is brain activity that happens when these people are moving their affected hands. And what you can see is a general focusing back down onto what looks like a relatively normal activation pattern, except that both these patients are moving the same hand. So you can see here, this patient is using the left side of his brain to move the right hand. This patient is using the right side of the brain to move the right hand. So there is some kind of reorganization of surviving brain regions and networks that supports recovery. So how does that happen? Well, we need to think about plasticity. The point about plasticity is it's the most fundamental property of the brain. So what do we mean by it? Well, we mean that the structure changes, so the function changes, and this comes about through changes in the environment or experience. Some kind of training will lead to this. So it's the basis of all learning. So if you learn something, there will be a structural change in your brain. And the structure that we're talking about is in the cortex, where there are 100 billion nerve cells, and they look a little bit like this. As far as the brain function goes, it's not about the number of brain cells that you've got. It's about the number of connections that you have. It's a very dynamic environment. It's not hardwired, it's not fixed. You can look at these kind of cells. These are actually from zebrafish, not from humans, but we're not that different from zebrafish. It's an incredibly dynamic environment. It looks like these cells are looking for connections the whole time. So in terms of plasticity, what we're looking for is strengthening existing connections, forming new connections, or getting rid of connections that we don't need. So when it comes to strengthening existing connections, this is all about how much activity goes across this connection. So more activity going across, you get a stronger connection. Less activity going across, you have a weaker connection. So essentially, use it or lose it. But it is also important to realize that the effect of the activity going across that connection can be up or down regulated by a number of factors. In other words, the potential for plasticity can be altered by certain conditions, and that should be something that we're very interested in rehabilitation when we're thinking about promoting recovery after stroke. The most fundamental factor that changes the potential for plasticity is actually the stroke itself. So we've known for decades from animal models that after damage, there is an increase in the potential for plasticity that comes about through expression of a number of cells and molecules. So in a way, the adult brain becomes very much like a highly plastic developing brain. So that if we were to ask, when should we be giving our rehabilitation, these results should tell us that we should be going early. I'll give you another example. These two sets of rats are housed in different environments. One is in a standard cage, one is in a so-called enriched environment. Now, the animals that live in the enriched environment are better at learning. The reason that they're better at learning is because the structure of their brain cells is different. You can see more projections here, more branches. The more branches you've got, the more chance you've got of forming new connections, the more chance you've got of learning. So we would predict that if you gave those animals a stroke, and then you gave them the same amount of training, that the ones who live in the enriched environment would do better with rehabilitation. And in fact, that is exactly what happens. So what I'm trying to get across here is that learning or recovery are dependent on training and rehabilitation. And whilst it may be the case that the more training and rehab that you give, the better the learning and the recovery, we also know that we can change the state of the brain in order to try and enhance the effects of training. And we've already talked about two particular conditions, so enriched environments or time post-stroke, modulating plasticity to enhance the effects of training, but there are also drugs and forms of brain stimulation that can try and do the same thing. But it's really important to remember that this just changes the effect of the training. Okay, so if you don't give any training, then this isn't going to have any effect. So drugs like fluoxetine or things like brain stimulation do not have an effect on recovery on their own. They just change the effect of training. So how do we take these findings from neuroscience and move them into our clinical practice? Well, these are the Royal College of Physicians guidelines for what people should receive after rehabilitation. So we talk about 45 minutes of each appropriate therapy for as long as patients can tolerate it and continue to benefit, which sounds like a good thing, right? But actually that's not what happens. We know from the audit of our acute stroke services, the patients are getting about 16 minutes a day of physio and occupational therapy. They're getting about 13 minutes of speech and language therapy, and I'm not sure whether they're getting any psychology at all. And we know after that, we've already said, people feel abandoned. How are we taking those findings from the neuroscience that I mentioned into our clinical trials? Well, unfortunately, most of the clinical trials are really looking at pretty low doses of the intervention. They do that for pragmatic reasons because of the worry that it's going to be too expensive or it's going to be too difficult to implement in healthcare practice. There is some evidence that higher, more aspirational doses are having an effect, but this is going to have to change the way we deliver rehabilitation services, not just in the UK, but worldwide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the service that we run at Queen Square. So we run an intensive upper limb neurorehabilitation program. The patients that we see on this program have finished with their treatment in the NHS, and they're usually not receiving any further treatment. So they're at least 6 months post-stroke, what you'd call chronic. So what we do is we're delivering intense therapy for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 3 weeks. So that's 90 hours, otherwise known as boot camp. And these are our results. So I'm going to show you some results of from a score called the Fugl-Meyer score, because it's a measure of impairment. And you can see that we're taking on board quite a wide range of impairments here on admission. And then 3 weeks later on discharge, that score's gone up by 8 points. And that's more than almost all of the clinical trials that have been published. And what's also interesting to us is that at 6 weeks and 6 months, those scores continue to go up, because what those patients have learned on our program, they are now able to implement in their day-to-day lives. So what does that tell us? Well, I think it tells us that there is some hope. It tells us that if we give big doses of the right rehabilitation, then we can drive big changes in people, sometimes years after stroke. But what is the right rehabilitation? So this is actually the tricky question. So we've had to think about this in our program. We've talked to people who've been on the program. We've talked to the people who are doing the treating. And we came to the same conclusion that actually rehabilitation is complex. And by complex, I don't mean that it's somehow mysterious and unknowable, which is what I think many of you in the room probably think. What I mean by that is that it has many components to it, and those components interact with one another, and they're all necessary. So, for example, specialist knowledge is absolutely key here. So when you're asked to assess this gentleman and you're asked the question, why does his arm not work? The answer cannot be because he's had a stroke, because that does not help you to treat him. It has to include the fact that he has profound weakness, that he has scapular instability. You have to know whether he's got sensory loss, whether he's got apraxia, whether he's got cognitive dysfunction, pain, fatigue, depression. And the reason that we need to know those things is because they impact on his impairment and they are treatable. Secondly, the goals need to be individualized. Does the person want to get back into the kitchen? Do they want to get back into the garden? What is it that they need to do to get back to work? If you can get buy-in from the patients based on their individualized goals, they are far more likely to remain active when they go home. Thirdly, when you've decided on the thing that needs practicing, it needs high dose, high intensity. And lastly, self-efficacy, by which I mean providing patients with the knowledge, the skills, the motivation, the tools generally to carry on, not literally the tools, but sometimes the tools, to carry on with doing what it is that they've learned on the program. And this is a video that one of our patients sent in to us. So in a way, rehabilitation is a bit like coaching. So if a young Serena Williams came to you and said, I want to be the greatest tennis player that the world has ever seen, you would know that she would need a coach with specialist knowledge who provided her with individualized goals, who promoted high dose and high intensity practice, but also realized that she needed the self-motivation and determination to succeed. So these guys are not Serena Williams or Roger Federer, and yet they have to work just as hard to improve, or even in some cases to stand still. So what can we do for them? Because I feel at the moment that we're letting them down. So I've talked this evening about a number of principles or factors that I think are important in moving this field forward. And we need to start doing high dose intervention. We need to be giving hundreds or thousands of hours of therapy. Patients cannot remain inactive and alone. Secondly, we need to think about rehabilitation as being complex. We need to stop doing clinical trials of homeopathic doses of simplistic interventions. They don't work. Thirdly, we really need to think about understanding what we've learned from science. We need to think about delivering our rehabilitation interventions in biologically optimal time windows. And if we can't do that, we need to work out how we reopen those critical periods of brain plasticity using the biological treatments that we already have access to. So if we can do that, if we can get the motivation, the drive, the patience, the funding to do that work, then I think we might have a chance. And then I think we might be able to provide these guys with some hope. Thanks for your attention.